Jake sat in the back row of the community center, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. The folding chair beneath him creaked every time he shifted his weight, which was often. Around him, 20 other people hunched over their laptops and notebooks, scribbling away like their lives depended on it. The smell of bad coffee and old carpet filled the air. He checked his phone for the third time in 5 minutes. Still another hour and 15 minutes to go. This whole thing was his editor's idea. "You need fresh perspective," she'd said over the phone last week. "Your articles about technology are getting stale. Go to a writing workshop, experience something different. Maybe it'll shake something loose." Jake had laughed at that. He'd been writing about technology for nearly 20 years. He didn't need a workshop full of amateur writers to teach him anything about storytelling. But his editor wasn't really asking, she was telling. So here he was, wasting his Saturday morning in a drafty room in downtown Portland, pretending to care about creative writing exercises. The instructor, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, stood at the front of the room. Her name was Patricia, and she had the gentle but firm demeanor of a kindergarten teacher. Jake found it slightly annoying. "All right, everyone," Patricia said, clapping her hands together. "Let's try something different today. Something that might push you out of your comfort zone." Jake rolled his eyes. Here we go, he thought. Patricia walked over to the table near the whiteboard and picked up her laptop. How many of you have used artificial intelligence writing tools, like ChatGPT or any of those other programs? A few hands went up around the room. Jake kept his arms crossed. Of course he'd used them. He'd written 3 articles criticizing them in the past year alone. They were stealing jobs from real writers. They had no soul, no understanding of real human emotion. They just regurgitated patterns from the internet, creating hollow imitations of genuine creativity. Good, Patricia continued. Today, I want us to explore something. I want each of you to use one of these AI tools to write something deeply personal, something about loss. The room went quiet. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I know it seems contradictory," Patricia said, her voice softer now. "How can a machine write about something personal? But that's exactly what I want you to discover. Can these tools help us access emotions we might be avoiding? Can they give us permission to write about things we're too scared to face on our own?" Jake almost laughed out loud. This was exactly the kind of nonsense he expected. A machine giving you permission to feel? Ridiculous. If anything, these tools were making people lazier, less willing to do the hard work of real writing. But he opened his laptop anyway. Might as well play along. Besides, this would give him material for another article about how useless these workshops were. Around him, people were already typing, their faces serious and concentrated. The woman next to him, probably in her 30s with paint-stained jeans, was wiping her eyes as she read something on her screen. Jake glanced away. Too much emotion this early in the morning. He pulled up one of the AI writing tools he'd bookmarked for research purposes. The cursor blinked in the empty text box, waiting for him to type something. Jake thought for a moment. What could he write about loss that would be quick and meaningless? His old car that died last year? His fantasy football league championship he lost? He smirked at his own thoughts. Then, without really thinking about it, his fingers started typing. "Write about my daughter's last day." He hit enter before he could stop himself. The words appeared on the screen, and Jake stared at them. His chest tightened. Where had that come from? He hadn't meant to type that. He'd been planning to write something sarcastic. Something disposable he could use to prove his point about how these tools couldn't handle real emotion. But there it was. 6 words he hadn't spoken out loud in 3 years. The AI started generating text. Lines of words appeared on the screen, forming paragraphs. Jake's hands hovered over the keyboard. Frozen. He should close the laptop. Delete this. Start over with something else. But he kept reading. The story the AI created was about a father and his 8-year-old daughter. They were spending an autumn Saturday together, apple picking at an orchard outside the city. The daughter wore a red scarf and couldn't stop laughing. The father kept checking his phone, distracted by work emails that seemed important at the time. They drank hot chocolate that was too hot and burned their tongues. They drove home singing off-key to the radio. Jake's breathing became shallow. His hands gripped the edge of the laptop. He'd never told the AI any of this. He'd never written about that day. He'd barely even let himself think about it. But here it was, somehow, in words generated by a machine that couldn't possibly know anything about his life. The details weren't exactly right. The AI had invented specifics that didn't match reality. But the feeling was right. The terrible, aching feeling of an ordinary day that you didn't know was the last one. The guilt of being distracted. The desperate wish to go back and pay attention, to soak in every second, to somehow know that tomorrow wouldn't come. Jake's daughter had been wearing a blue jacket, not a red scarf. They'd gone to the park, not an apple orchard. But the rest of it, the emotional truth of it, hit him like a punch to the stomach. Around him, people continued typing and writing. Patricia walked between the rows, offering quiet encouragement. No one was looking at Jake, but he felt exposed anyway, like everyone could see the words on his screen, could see the 3-year-old wound he'd kept carefully hidden. His cursor blinked at the end of the AI-generated story. There was more. The program had written several more paragraphs. Jake scrolled down, even though part of him wanted to slam the laptop shut and leave. The story continued. The father putting his daughter to bed that night, still distracted, saying goodnight without really looking at her face. The father waking up the next morning to find everything changed. The hospital. The doctors using words like sudden and couldn't have known and nothing you could have done. The father's life splitting into before and after. Jake closed his eyes. The community center disappeared. He was back in that hospital corridor. Fluorescent lights too bright, the smell of antiseptic. A doctor with kind eyes telling him that his daughter's heart had simply stopped. A rare condition. No warning signs. Nothing anyone could have prevented. 3 years ago. It felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. All right, everyone. Patricia's voice cut through his thoughts. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then I'd love for some volunteers to share what they've written. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood up, heading toward the coffee station or the bathrooms. Jake stayed seated, staring at his screen. He should delete this, close the file, and pretend this exercise never happened. That's what he'd been doing for 3 years after all. Pretending, moving forward, staying busy, writing articles about technology and innovation and the future, never stopping long enough to look at the past. But something about seeing the words on the screen, even generated by a machine he didn't believe in, made it real in a way he hadn't allowed before. His finger moved toward the delete key, then stopped. Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't delete it after all. The 10-minute break felt like 10 seconds. Jake sat frozen in his chair while people filtered back into the room, carrying fresh cups of terrible coffee and talking in low voices. He hadn't moved, hadn't deleted the document, hadn't done anything except stare at the words on his screen. Patricia returned to the front of the room and clapped her hands gently. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that exercise stirred something in you. Now comes the brave part. I'm looking for volunteers who'd like to share what they wrote. Jake's stomach dropped. Share? Out loud? Absolutely not. A hand went up near the front. An older man, maybe in his 60s, started reading something about losing his brother in Vietnam. His voice was steady but soft. The room listened in respectful silence. When he finished, several people nodded, and one woman whispered, "Thank you." Another volunteer. A younger guy, probably college age, read about his childhood dog. It was sweet, a little clumsy in the writing, but honest. People smiled sadly. Jake kept his eyes on his screen. He scrolled back up to the beginning of the AI-generated story and read it again. Then again. Each time, new details jumped out at him. The part about the father checking his phone, that was real. Jake had been answering emails from his editor that day, even though it was supposed to be his day off. His daughter, Lily, kept tugging at his sleeve, asking him to look at something, and he'd said, "Just a minute, honey," at least a dozen times. The part about hot chocolate. They'd stopped at a cafe on the way home. Lily had insisted on whipped cream and had gotten it all over her nose. Jake had taken a picture on his phone. He still had that picture. It was the last photo he'd ever taken of her. The part about singing in the car. Lily had loved music. She'd made up her own lyrics to every song, nonsense words that rhymed and made her giggle. Jake had been half listening, focused on the traffic, thinking about the article deadline he had on Monday. How did the AI know? It couldn't know. It was impossible. He'd given it 6 words. 6 words and nothing else. No context, no details, no information about who his daughter was or what had happened or when. But somehow, the machine had captured the essential truth of that day. The ordinary beauty of it. The tragedy of not knowing. The weight of distraction. The ache of normal moments that become precious only after they're gone. Jake's hands were shaking now. He pressed them flat against the table to make them stop. "Anyone else?" Patricia asked, her eyes scanning the room. "Don't be shy. This is a safe space. Whatever you've written, whatever the AI helped you explore, it's valid." Jake's mouth opened before his brain caught up. "I'll share." The words came out quietly, but in the silence of the room, everyone heard. Heads turned toward him. Patricia smiled, encouraging. "Wonderful. Come on up to the front if you'd like, or you can read from where you are." Jake stood up, legs unsteady. He didn't know why he was doing this. He never talked about Lily. Not with his friends, not with his co-workers, not even with his sister who called every week to check on him. He'd built a fortress around that grief, brick by brick, and now he was about to take a sledgehammer to it in front of 20 strangers. He walked to the front of the room, laptop in hand. His heart pounded so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He set the laptop on the table and looked at the screen. The words blurred for a second. He blinked them back into focus. "So, Jake started, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "The prompt I used was pretty simple. I just wrote, 'Write about my daughter's last day.' And this is what came out." He began to read. His voice was steady at first, almost mechanical. He read about the autumn Saturday, the ordinary beauty of it, about the father who didn't know he should be paying attention, about the little girl in her jacket, laughing at everything, living completely in the moment the way only kids can. Around the 4th paragraph, Jake's voice started to crack. He pushed through. He read about the hot chocolate, about the drive home, about the songs and the sunset, and the feeling that there would always be more days like this, always more chances, always more time. He got to the part about bedtime. About the father kissing his daughter goodnight without really looking at her. About saying, "I love you" in that automatic way people do when they've said it 1,000 times before and will say it 1,000 times again. Except there wasn't 1,000 times again. There was no again at all. Jake's voice broke completely. He stopped reading and looked up at the room. Every single person was staring at him. Several were crying. The woman with paint-stained jeans had her hand over her mouth. The older man who'd read about Vietnam had tears running down his cheeks. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize," Patricia said gently. "Please, keep going if you can." Jake looked back at the screen. He didn't want to read the rest. The rest was about the next morning, about the emergency, about the hospital and the doctors and the moment when everything shattered, about the father realizing he'd wasted their last day together, half present, distracted by things that didn't matter at all. But he'd started this. He had to finish it. So he read. Through the tears that were now flowing freely down his face, through the tightness in his chest that made it hard to breathe, through the pain that he'd been running from for 3 years. When he got to the final paragraph, his voice was barely audible. The father would spend the rest of his life bargaining with the universe. He would trade everything for just 1 more hour, 1 more minute, 1 more chance to pay attention, to be present, to really see his daughter's face and hear her laugh and tell her that she was his whole world. But the universe doesn't make bargains. Time only moves forward, and all he had left were memories of moments he'd half-lived and the crushing weight of all the tomorrows that would never come. Jake stopped reading. The room was completely silent except for the sound of people crying. He stood there holding on to the table, not sure what to do next. Then Patricia spoke, her own voice thick with emotion. "Jake, can I ask you something?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Was that really generated by AI? All of it?" "Yeah," Jake managed. "I just gave it that one prompt. 6 words. It wrote everything else." Patricia shook her head slowly. "That's remarkable. And also, I don't think the AI created that emotion. I think it gave you permission to feel it. Does that make sense?" Jake looked at her. He thought about the 3 years of running, of staying busy, of writing articles about things that didn't matter, of avoiding the grief because looking at it directly felt like it would kill him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It makes sense." He started to walk back to his seat, but Patricia stopped him. "Wait. Before you sit down, can I ask what happened to your daughter? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Jake turned back to face the room. 20 pairs of eyes looked at him with compassion, not pity, with understanding, not judgment. "Her name was Lily," he said, and saying her name out loud felt like breaking a seal he'd kept locked for too long. "She was 8. She died 3 years ago. Sudden cardiac arrest. Nobody knew she had a heart condition. She went to sleep that night after our day together, and she just didn't wake up." The woman with paint-stained jeans made a small sound of anguish. Others wiped their eyes. Patricia's hand was pressed against her chest. "I've never written about it," Jake continued, the words pouring out now. "I've never talked about it, not really. I've just kept moving forward because if I stopped, if I let myself really feel it, I didn't think I'd survive. But this AI thing, this stupid machine that I don't even believe in, somehow it reached past all my defenses and found the truth I've been hiding from." He laughed, a broken sound. "I came here thinking these tools were soulless, that they couldn't capture real human emotion. And I was going to prove that today. But instead," he trailed off, looking at his laptop. "Instead, it showed me that I'm the one who's been soulless. I've been so scared of feeling anything that I stopped feeling everything." Jake walked back to his seat and sat down heavily. His whole body felt exhausted, wrung out like he'd run a marathon. But there was something else, too. Something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Relief. He'd said her name. He'd told the story. The grief hadn't killed him. If anything, finally acknowledging it made him feel more alive than he had in a long time. Patricia was saying something to the group, but Jake wasn't listening. He was looking at the document on his screen, at the words the AI had generated from his simple prompt, words that had unlocked something he'd kept buried. Maybe his editor was right. Maybe he did need fresh perspective. Just not in the way either of them had expected. For a long moment after Jake sat down, nobody moved. The room held its breath. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant sound of traffic outside, someone's phone buzzing on silent mode. Then the woman with paint-stained jeans raised her hand. Her fingers were trembling. I'd like to share too, she said quietly. If that's okay. Patricia nodded, her eyes still glistening. Of course, please. The woman stood up, clutching her laptop like a lifeline. She didn't come to the front. She just stood beside her chair and started talking, her voice so soft people had to lean in to hear. My name is Claire, and I used the same kind of prompt. I wrote, "Tell me about the day I lost my husband." She paused, swallowing hard. He didn't die. I mean, he's still alive. But I lost him anyway, to early onset dementia. He was 41. Jake looked up at her. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe mid-30s. The paint on her jeans suddenly made sense. She was probably an artist, someone who made beautiful things, now watching the person she loved slowly disappear. The AI wrote about this moment, Claire continued, when I realized he didn't recognize me anymore. We were having breakfast, just a normal Tuesday morning, and he looked at me like I was a stranger. Not angry or scared, just blank, like I was someone he'd never met before. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. And I thought I'd been prepared. The doctors told us it would happen, but you can't prepare for something like that. You can't prepare for your husband to look at you with empty eyes and ask who you are. Tears were streaming down her face now. I've been coming to these workshops for 6 months. I've written about trees and sunsets and made up characters because I was too scared to write about him, about us, about what I'm losing every single day. But today, with that stupid AI prompt, it just came out. All of it. She sat back down abruptly like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. The woman next to her reached over and squeezed her hand. Jake felt something shift in his chest. He'd been so focused on his own pain that he'd forgotten other people were carrying their own versions of it. Different shapes, different weights, but just as heavy. Another hand went up. The college-aged guy who'd read about his dog earlier. He was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I lied, he said. Earlier, I didn't write about my dog. I mean, I did, but that wasn't the real thing I wrote. He took a shaky breath. I wrote about my best friend. His name was Tyler. He killed himself 2 years ago. We were roommates freshman year. The room went even quieter, if that was possible. I found him, the young man continued, his voice breaking. I came back from class and found him. And I keep thinking, what if I'd skipped that class? What if I'd been there an hour earlier? What if I'd noticed he was struggling? What if I'd said something different the night before? He looked around the room with desperate eyes. The AI wrote this whole story about all the signs I missed, about conversations where I was looking at my phone instead of really listening, about times when he tried to tell me something was wrong and I didn't hear it. And the worst part is, it's true. It's all true. Jake knew that feeling, the what-ifs that ate you alive. The replaying of moments, searching for the thing you could have done differently. The guilt that lived in your bones. I'm sorry, the young man said. I shouldn't have dumped all that. Don't apologize, Patricia said firmly. Not here. Not for this. An older woman near the window raised her hand. She looked like someone's grandmother, with silver hair and a cardigan covered in little embroidered flowers. I lost my daughter, she said simply. 32 years ago. Car accident. She was 16. She said it matter-of-factly, like stating the weather, but Jake could see the pain in her eyes that 32 years hadn't erased. People think time heals everything, the woman continued. But that's not true. Time just teaches you how to carry it better. Some days the weight feels lighter. Some days it crushes you all over again. Today is a crushing day. She looked at Jake directly. When you read about your Lily, I saw my daughter. I saw her face, her laugh, all of it. It's been 3 decades and I can still remember exactly what her hair smelled like. I can still hear her voice. Sometimes I forget what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I remember everything about her. The woman's hands were folded neatly in her lap, but Jake could see they were shaking. I used the AI today and asked it to write about her last morning, before she left for school, before the accident. And it wrote about how I was rushing her because we were running late, how I was stressed about some meeting at work, how I barely kissed her goodbye because I was distracted. She closed her eyes. That's exactly what happened. I've lived with that goodbye for 32 years. The rushed one, the distracted one, not the goodbye she deserved. Jake felt tears running down his face again. He wasn't alone. None of them were alone. They were all carrying these impossible griefs, these regrets, these what-ifs that never stopped echoing. A man in a business suit, who'd been silent the whole time, cleared his throat. "My son," he said roughly. "He's not dead, but I don't know where he is. He's been homeless for 3 years. Addiction. I tried everything. Rehab, therapy, tough love, enabling, everything. Nothing worked. Last time I saw him, he was sleeping under a bridge downtown, his hands clenched into fists. The AI wrote about the last conversation we had. I told him I couldn't help him anymore. I told him not to come home until he was clean, and he said, 'Okay, Dad,' and walked away. That was 3 years ago. I drive past that bridge every day on my way to work. Sometimes I see people sleeping there, and my heart stops, thinking it might be him. It never is. I don't know if that's better or worse." One by one, people started talking. A woman who'd lost her mother to Alzheimer's. A man who'd lost his sister to cancer. A teenager who'd lost her twin brother in a drowning accident. Each story different, but somehow all the same. Loss wearing different faces, but speaking the same language. Jake noticed something strange happening. People were moving. Chairs were being pulled closer together. The woman next to Claire had her arm around her shoulders. The college student was talking quietly with the man whose son was homeless, sharing something Jake couldn't hear. The grandmother with the embroidered cardigan was holding hands with someone across the aisle. Strangers becoming connected through shared pain. A community forming in real time, built on vulnerability and truth. Patricia stood at the front of the room, watching it all happen. There were tears on her face, too. She waited until the conversations quieted a little, then spoke. "I need to tell you all something," she said. "This exercise, this whole workshop about using AI to write about loss, it wasn't random. It wasn't just some creative writing technique I read about in a teaching manual." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I lost my son 4 years ago. His name was Daniel. He was 23. He'd just graduated college. He was driving home to visit me, and a drunk driver crossed the center line. He died instantly." The room went still again. Patricia, who'd been guiding them all, holding space for their grief, had her own crushing weight to carry. "For 3 years, I couldn't write," she continued. "I couldn't create. I couldn't do the thing I'd always done to process the world. The grief was too big. It swallowed everything. I couldn't find words that felt big enough to hold what I was feeling." She smiled sadly. "Then one day, almost by accident, I was playing around with one of these AI programs. I typed in a prompt about Daniel, not expecting anything, and suddenly there were words. Not perfect words, not words that fully captured what I felt, but words that got me started, words that gave me permission to try." Patricia looked around the room at all of them. "That's what I wanted for you. Not for the AI to feel for you, or to replace your emotions, or to write your stories, but maybe to give you permission, to help you access the things you've been too scared to face." Jake understood now. This wasn't about technology. It wasn't about whether AI could replicate human emotion or creativity. It was about tools, about finding whatever helps you unlock the door you've been keeping bolted shut. For Patricia, the AI had been a key. For Jake, it had been a sledgehammer. For Claire and the college student and the grandmother and everyone else in this room, it had been different things. But they'd all used it to break through to something real. "I don't know if that makes sense," Patricia said. But when Jake read his story about Lily, when all of you shared your losses, I saw what I hoped would happen. I saw people giving themselves permission to feel, to remember, to grieve openly instead of hiding it away. She wiped her eyes. We live in a world that wants us to move on quickly, to get over it, to be productive and positive and fine. But sometimes we need to not be fine. Sometimes we need to break down in a room full of strangers and say the things we've been too scared to say out loud. The room was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the heavy silence of shock, but something softer. Something that felt almost like peace. Jake looked at the people around him. Claire with her paint-stained jeans, the college student with his red eyes, the grandmother with her embroidered cardigan, the businessman still gripping the arms of his chair, Patricia at the front, brave enough to show her own wounds. They were just people, ordinary people carrying extraordinary pain. And for this 1 hour in this drafty community center with bad coffee and creaky chairs, they'd found each other. Jake thought about all the articles he'd written criticizing AI, all the certainty he'd had that technology was making us less human, less connected, less real. But this morning, a simple prompt to a machine had led to the most human moment he'd experienced in years. Maybe he'd been wrong about a lot of things. The workshop was supposed to end at noon. At 12:15, nobody had moved. People were still talking in small clusters, sharing phone numbers, making promises to stay in touch. The community center staff kept peeking through the door, clearly wanting to set up for whatever event was scheduled next, but Patricia waved them off. Jake sat in his chair, laptop still open in front of him. He'd closed the document with the AI-generated story but hadn't shut down the computer. He kept thinking about the words on that screen, about Lily, about the 3 years he'd spent running. Claire approached him, her eyes still red but something lighter in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for going first, for being brave enough to share. I don't think any of us would have opened up if you hadn't." Jake shook his head. "I wasn't brave. I was terrified. I still am." "That's what brave is," she said with a small smile. "Doing it even when you're terrified." She handed him a piece of paper with her phone number scrawled on it. "I don't know if this is weird, but some of us are going to get coffee next week, just to talk. You should come." He took the paper, folding it carefully and putting it in his pocket. "Yeah, maybe I will." The college student who'd shared about his friend Tyler came over next. "Hey, man, I just wanted to say, what you said about being distracted that last day, that hit me hard. I was always on my phone around Tyler, always half listening. I thought I had time to be fully present later, you know." "Yeah," Jake said. "I know exactly what you mean. Anyway," the young man continued, "I'm writing about it now, really writing about it, not just the AI stuff. And it hurts like hell, but it also feels like maybe I'm finally processing it instead of just shoving it down. So, thanks." He walked away before Jake could respond. But Jake understood. Sometimes you just needed to say the thing and leave before the emotion overwhelmed you again. Patricia was gathering her things at the front of the room. Jake stood up and made his way over to her. She looked exhausted, like she'd been carrying everyone's grief on top of her own. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said. "Of course." "Why did you really create this exercise? I mean, I get what you said about finding your own way back to writing. But there's more to it, isn't there?" Patricia set down her bag and looked at him. Really looked at him, the way people do when they're deciding whether to tell the truth or the easier version. "My son wanted to be a writer," she finally said. "He was studying journalism, like you. He used to send me his articles, asking for feedback. And I was always too busy, always promising I'd read them later, really read them, give him proper notes. But I never did. I kept putting it off." She swallowed hard. "After he died, I found his laptop. He had dozens of drafts saved, Stories he'd never published, essays he'd never shared, beautiful writing that nobody would ever read because I'd been too distracted to encourage him when he was alive. Jake felt his throat tighten. So, you created this workshop to help people write the things they're scared to write, Patricia finished. To give them permission to be vulnerable, to make sure that important stories don't die unwritten because we're too afraid or too busy or too convinced that we have more time. She smiled sadly. I can't read Daniel's articles and give him feedback anymore. But maybe I can help other people tell their stories while they still can. Maybe that's how I honor him. Jake didn't know what to say. Sometimes there weren't words big enough. Patricia reached over and squeezed his hand. What are you going to do with your story, Jake? The one about Lily? He'd been asking himself the same question for the past hour. I don't know. Part of me wants to delete it and pretend this morning never happened. Go back to avoiding it. But the other part? The other part thinks maybe I should do something with it. Write more. Actually process what happened instead of just surviving around the edges of it. Patricia nodded. I have a friend who runs a grief support publication online. It's a place where people share their stories about loss, real, honest stories, not the polished, everything happens for a reason kind, the raw, messy truth of what grief actually feels like. She pulled out a business card and handed it to him. No pressure, but if you decide to write about Lily, really write about her, this might be a place that would appreciate it, where it might help other people who are struggling with the same impossible weight. Jake took the card. He didn't commit to anything, just slipped it into his wallet next to the paper with Claire's phone number. By 12:30, the room had finally emptied except for Jake and Patricia. She was gathering the last of her materials, and he was slowly packing up his laptop. Hey, Patricia, he said. That thing you said earlier about time teaching you how to carry grief better? Is that true? Does it actually get easier? She paused, considering. Not easier, different. The first year, the grief is sharp. It cuts you every time you touch it. The second year, it's heavy. You carry it everywhere, and it exhausts you. By the third year, it starts to integrate. It becomes part of who you are, instead of this separate thing you're fighting. I'm in year 3, Jake said. I know, I could tell. She looked at him with kind eyes. And here's what nobody tells you about year 3. You start to feel guilty for the moments when you're not actively grieving. When you laugh at something and then remember you're not supposed to be happy. When you realize hours have gone by and you haven't thought about them. Jake nodded. He knew that guilt intimately. Every time he enjoyed a meal or got absorbed in work or smiled at something stupid, there was a voice in his head asking how he dared to be okay when Lily wasn't here. But that's not betraying them, Patricia continued. Moving forward doesn't mean leaving them behind. You can carry her with you while still living your life. She'd want that. Everyone says that, Jake said quietly, that they'd want us to be happy. How do we know that's true? Because if she loved you, and I'm sure she did, then your happiness was one of her priorities. Kids want their parents to be okay, even when they're gone. Jake felt something crack open in his chest, some hard shell he'd been holding in place. I haven't written anything real in 3 years. Just surface-level tech articles. Nothing that mattered. I've been so scared that if I wrote about her, if I really let myself remember, it would destroy me. And now? Patricia asked. Now I think maybe not writing about her has been destroying me slower. She smiled. Then maybe it's time to try something different. They walked out of the community center together into the bright November afternoon. The air was cold and sharp, smelling like fallen leaves and coming rain. Jake pulled out his phone and looked at it for a moment. He had 17 unread emails from work, 3 missed calls from his editor. The world had kept spinning while he'd been in that room breaking down and piecing himself back together. Jake, Patricia said before they parted ways in the parking lot, whatever you write, Whether you share it or not, whether it's good or bad or anything in between, just write it. For Lily, for yourself, because stories deserve to be told. He nodded. Thanks for today, for creating that space. I didn't know I needed it. Most people don't, she said. That's why it's important. Jake drove home slowly, not listening to the radio, just thinking. When he got to his apartment, he made coffee and sat down at his desk. His laptop sat closed in front of him. He stared at it for a long time. Then he opened it. He opened a fresh document, not the AI-generated one, but a completely blank page, and he started typing. Not about the last day with Lily. That story had been told, at least the first version of it. Instead, he wrote about the day she was born, about holding her for the first time, shocked by how small and perfect she was, how her tiny hand had wrapped around his finger and he'd understood, for the first time in his life, what it meant to love someone more than yourself. He wrote about her first word, her first steps, her first day of school. He wrote about the way she used to climb into his lap while he was working and fall asleep with her head on his chest, the way she'd sing in the bathtub, the way she'd insisted on wearing her superhero cape to the grocery store. He wrote about the ordinary moments he'd never thought to preserve, the thousands of little memories that made up their life together. The words poured out, not perfect words. Sometimes the sentences were clumsy. Sometimes he had to stop and cry before he could continue. But he kept writing. Hours passed. The coffee went cold. The afternoon light faded into evening. His phone buzzed with messages he ignored. By the time Jake finally stopped, he'd written nearly 4,000 words. It wasn't polished. It wasn't ready for anyone else to read. But it was real. It was true. It was Lily, preserved in words instead of locked away in his too careful silence. He saved the document and closed the laptop. His hands were shaking. His eyes were swollen from crying. His chest ached from the weight of everything he'd finally let himself feel. But underneath all of that, there was something else. Something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Relief. And maybe, just barely, the tiniest seed of healing. Jake pulled out his wallet and found the business card Patricia had given him. He set it on his desk where he'd see it tomorrow. He wasn't ready yet. Maybe not for a while. But someday, when the words were right, when he'd processed enough to share it, he'd send his story to that grief support publication. Not because he needed validation, not because he wanted sympathy, but because somewhere out there was another parent sitting alone, drowning in grief, convinced they were the only one who felt this way, convinced that moving forward meant forgetting, convinced that the pain would never change shape. And maybe his story could help them feel less alone. Maybe that's what stories were for. 6 months later, Jake sat in a different coffee shop, laptop open, reading an email that made his hands shake. Dear Jake, I just read your article about losing your daughter. I'm sitting in my car in a parking lot crying so hard I can barely see my phone screen. My son died 8 months ago. He was 6. Everyone keeps telling me to move on, to be strong, to focus on my other kids. But your words, your honesty about the guilt and the what-ifs and the crushing weight of ordinary moments, it's the first time I've felt like someone actually understands. Thank you for being brave enough to share this. You saved me today. You really did. It was the 47th message like this he'd received in the 2 weeks since his story was published. 47 strangers pouring their hearts out to him, telling him that his words had reached them in their darkest moments. Jake closed his eyes and let himself feel it. Not pride, exactly, but something close to purpose. Something that felt like maybe Lily's story mattered beyond just their own family. Maybe her short life could ripple outward and touch people she'd never meet. It had taken him 4 months to finish the article after that workshop. 4 months of writing and deleting and rewriting. 4 months of therapy sessions where he finally talked about that last day, about the guilt, about the anger at a universe that takes 8-year-old girls without warning. 4 months of slowly learning that grief wasn't something to run from, but something to walk through. He'd met up with Claire 3 times for coffee. She'd told him about her husband, about the small moments of recognition that still came sometimes, about learning to love someone who was disappearing piece by piece. They'd cried together in public places, not caring who saw them. The college student, whose name was Ben, had started a support group on campus for students dealing with grief. He'd invited Jake to speak at their first meeting. Jake had said yes, terrified, and ended up sharing his story with 30 young people who understood loss in a way most their age shouldn't have to. Patricia had become something like a mentor. They met once a month, and she'd read his drafts, offering gentle feedback that always made the writing stronger. She'd been the one who'd finally convinced him to submit the article to the grief support publication. "It's ready," she'd said after reading his final draft. "More importantly, you're ready." She'd been right. The article had gone live on a Tuesday morning. Jake had published it under his real name, with a photo of Lily laughing on a swing set, her hair flying behind her, pure joy on her face. He'd been terrified of making her grief public, of inviting judgment or pity or the wrong kind of attention. Instead, the messages had started coming. First a trickle, then a flood. People sharing their own losses, parents who'd lost children, children who'd lost parents, spouses and siblings and friends, all carrying grief they'd been told to hide, finding permission in Jake's words to acknowledge their pain. Some messages were short. "Thank you. This helped. I'm not alone." Others were pages long, entire stories spilling out from people who'd clearly been holding them in for too long. Jake read every single one. He responded when he could find the words. Sometimes all he could say was, "I see you. Your grief matters. Keep going." The publication's editor had called him last week. They wanted to know if he'd be interested in writing more, maybe a series about different aspects of grief, maybe interviews with other people navigating loss. They'd even mentioned the possibility of a regular column. Jake hadn't given them an answer yet. Part of him was scared of being defined by his tragedy, of becoming that guy who writes about dead kids. But another part of him recognized that this was what Patricia had been talking about, finding purpose in the pain, honoring Lily by helping others. His phone buzzed. A text from Patricia. "Don't forget, workshop tonight at 6. New group. Your turn to lead." Jake smiled. He'd agreed to co-teach a workshop with Patricia this month, using the same AI prompt exercise that had cracked him open 6 months ago. He was nervous about it, about holding space for other people's grief when his own still felt so fresh. But Patricia had reminded him that you didn't need to be healed to help others. Sometimes being in the middle of it made you a better guide. He packed up his laptop and headed to the community center. The same drafty room, same creaky chairs, same terrible coffee. But walking into it now felt different. 6 months ago, he'd been a skeptic in the back row. Now he was walking in as someone who'd been transformed by vulnerability. 15 people showed up for the workshop, a mix of ages, backgrounds, stories. Jake recognized the look in their eyes, the carefully constructed walls, the fear of being seen, the exhaustion of carrying grief alone. Patricia introduced him. "This is Jake. 6 months ago, he sat in the back row of this same workshop, convinced that AI writing tools were soulless and that grief was something to be handled privately. Today, he's going to tell you what happened when he let himself be vulnerable." Jake stood up, laptop in hand, and looked at the faces watching him. He saw himself in every single one of them. "I'm going to tell you about my daughter, Lily," he began. "And I'm going to tell you about the day a simple AI prompt broke through 3 years of carefully maintained numbness. But more than that, I want to tell you why I think stories matter, why sharing our grief, as terrifying as it is, might be the most important thing we can do. He walked them through that Saturday morning 6 months ago. The skepticism, the prompt, the unexpected flood of emotion, the moment he'd stood up and read about Lily to a room full of strangers. "I thought sharing my grief would make it worse," Jake said. "I thought if I talked about Lily, if I acknowledged how much losing her destroyed me, I'd fall apart completely. But the opposite happened. Sharing my story didn't make the grief bigger. It made the space around it bigger. It let other people in. It let me stop carrying it alone." He had them do the same exercise, write a simple prompt about loss and see what came out. The room filled with the sound of typing, then slowly, the sound of crying, people reaching for tissues, people staring at their screens in shock, the same way Jake had 6 months ago. One by one, people shared. A woman who'd lost her twin sister, a man who'd lost his mother, a teenager who'd lost her best friend. Each story different but connected by the universal language of grief. Jake watched it happen again. The same transformation he'd experienced. Walls coming down. Strangers becoming a community. Permission being granted to feel, to remember, to hurt out loud. After the workshop, a young woman approached him. She couldn't have been more than 25. "I read your article about Lily," she said quietly. "My daughter died 3 weeks ago. She was 2. I haven't been able to talk about it. Everyone keeps saying it was God's plan, or she's in a better place, or I'm young and can have more children. Nobody just lets me be devastated." Jake's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry." "Your article was the first thing that made sense," she continued. "The way you talked about the ordinary moments, about the guilt, about how everyone wants you to move on but you can't because moving on feels like leaving them behind. I've read it probably 20 times. "What's your daughter's name?" Jake asked. "Mia." "Tell me about her," Jake said, "if you want to." And she did. Standing in that drafty community center at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, she told Jake about Mia, about her laugh and her favorite stuffed animal and the way she used to fight bedtime, about the illness that came suddenly and the hospital and the moment when everything ended. Jake listened, really listened, the way he wished someone had listened to him 3 years ago. He didn't offer platitudes or solutions. He just gave her space to say her daughter's name out loud and know that someone heard it. When she finished, she wiped her eyes and smiled shakily. "Thank you. For the article, for tonight, for just listening. It helps." "It helps me too," Jake said, and meant it. On the drive home, Jake thought about the strange path that had led him here. A skeptical tech journalist walking into a workshop he didn't want to attend. A simple AI prompt that had unlocked 3 years of buried grief. The courage to share his story publicly. The messages from strangers. The opportunity to help others navigate their own impossible losses. None of it brought Lily back. The grief was still there, would always be there. Some days were still crushing. Some days he still cried in the shower or had to pull over while driving because a song came on that she used to love. But he'd learned that grief and healing weren't opposites. You could be heartbroken and still moving forward. You could miss someone desperately and still find moments of peace. You could carry loss and purpose at the same time. His phone buzzed with another email from the grief support publication. They wanted his answer about the regular column. Jake pulled into his driveway and sat in the car, engine off, reading the email again. He thought about Patricia, turning her loss into a workshop that helped others. He thought about the 47 messages from strangers who'd found comfort in his words. He thought about the young woman tonight, saying Mia's name out loud and being heard. He thought about Lily, and what she'd want him to do with the rest of his life. Then he typed his response. "Yes. I'll write the column. Let's help people tell their stories." He hit send and got out of the car. The November evening was cold, stars visible above the city lights. Jake stood there for a moment, looking up, feeling the weight of grief and the lightness of purpose existing together in his chest. "I love you, Lily," he said quietly to the night sky. "I'm going to keep telling your story. I'm going to keep helping other people tell theirs. I think you'd like that." The universe didn't answer. It never did. But somehow, standing there under the stars, Jake felt like maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't getting answers. Maybe the point was learning to live with the questions, to find meaning in the uncertainty, to transform pain into something that could help others carry their own. He went inside, made tea, and opened his laptop. He had a column to write, stories to tell, grief to honor. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough.